It's no secret that in contemporary Western culture, young men are facing an enormous set of challenges to their instincts and their identity. Of unparalleled significance is the pressure they are under from many young women, as expressed through their power drive for narcissistic self-gratification. When this arises in a relationship, it is one of the most destructive things a young man can experience, with the most sinister part being it is actively encouraged by the ongoing gaslighting coming out of the culture. A shit test, so to speak, from the collective genome at large. This video, taken from a recent high-level IPSA professional training seminar hosted by Steve and Pauline Richards, depth psychologists with 43 years each of frontline clinical experience, explores the psychodynamics of female narcissism in relationships, and how men can prepare themselves to hold their ground and not fall victim to it. Just very briefly, we'd like to share with you some essential background to set the stage for this video. Everything I'm about to say, I've learned from my continued professional mentorship under Steve and Pauline. Human beings, like all animals, cannot escape Charles Darwin. This is true for men and for women. In short, every piece of our psychobiology was shaped via evolution in the Paleolithic towards the intended teleology of adaptation and homeostasis. Adaptation is mediated moment to moment by Panksepp's 7 basic emotional systems, or the Panksepian instincts. These discrete neuroaffective circuits, concentrated in the subcortical regions of the brain, motivate action in the environment in order to meet our core adaptive needs. They are so ancient that we share them in common with all mammalian species. As humans, however, we also have the imperative to adapt to our relatively advanced culture and complex social behaviour. As such, we have evolved a second class of instinct, the meta-instincts. These anticipate a uniquely human context for Panksepp, recognisable to ego consciousness as a narrative that encompasses whole situations for the human journey. Each firing of a Pankseppian instinct seeks a simple, immediate goal, directly aimed at homeostasis. Meta-instincts, however, orchestrate Panksepp into a recognisable whole context of lifespan developmental significance. When an individual is well adapted, the Darwinian imperative dials itself down. When instincts are frustrated, however, such as through enormous adaptive pressure from the culture, which negatively influences meta-instincts away from facilitating homeostatic psychosocial relating, they fire outside of an optimally healthy context and seek, therefore, purely personal gratification. Good relating is replaced by narcissism in service of the immediate survival of the individual genome, in line with the trajectory of the collective. Steve and Pauline have introduced the following formula, which describes the dynamics and the trajectory of just such an instinctual pathology. It excellently explains how and why narcissism emerges through an overamped female power drive. Freud seeks Adler. Adler conceals Freud. Jung inflates and falls victim to both. Frustrated instinct, Freud, fires forward in service of Darwin, extending into the relationship, Adler, in order to seek gratification. In doing so, the psychosocial adaptation, Adler, conceals the frustrated instinct, Freud, underneath, but it is always present as the driving force of narcissistic pathology. As Pauline says later in this video, in relationships, Adler is the kiss of death. Where a woman's will to power reigns in service of Darwin and Freud, There is no relating to the man. There is only manipulation, no matter how covert it appears to be, in service purely of self-gratification. This, expressed in short, is the trap many young men find themselves in, falling victim to the cultural tides that have encouraged Adler to emerge in many young women, for their own Freudian and Darwinian gain, leaving them unprepared with how to relate to it. There is a parallel to this in myth, as one of the oldest extant stories our civilization has, the Judgement of Paris, the precipitating cause of the Trojan War from Homer's Iliad. The following has been adapted from Steve and Pauline's Discover Your Personal Myth Ultimate Handbook. The Trojan prince, Paris, is tasked with giving an apple to one of three goddesses: Hera, queen of Olympus; Athena, goddess of wisdom; and Aphrodite, goddess of love. Whichever one of them he deems the most beautiful gets the apple. Each of them tempts him with something in return. Hera offers him power, to become king of Europe and Asia. Athena offers him wisdom and skill in warfare. Aphrodite offers him the most beautiful mortal woman in the world, Helen. Paris gives the apple to Aphrodite. In doing so, he immediately makes an inevitable enemy out of the other two goddesses, Hera and Athena. Or, in other words, he chose to possess love and beauty, and in doing so, he made an enemy out of power and wisdom. This choice sealed his fate and the fate of his people in the upcoming Trojan War. The trap of having to choose one over the other two would always have led to his inevitable destruction. If he'd have chosen power over wisdom and beauty, then he would never have known Helen, and he would not have had the wisdom to know how to use his power. Hence, his fate would have been sealed. Had he chosen wisdom over power and beauty, then he would have led an otherwise powerless existence, something unthinkable to a prince whose life was shaped by power, and he'd never have known the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. The Judgement of Paris can be re-envisioned as Aphrodite, Hera, and Athena being analogous to Freud, Adler, and Jung, in that order. If you give the apple to only one of them, then you inevitably compromise the other two. If you choose Freud, instinct, then you necessarily compromise psychosocial adaptation, Adler, and the spiritual and transpersonal, Jung. If you choose Adler, then it is instinct, Freud, and the spiritual and transpersonal, Jung, which are made a metaphorical enemy of. If, however, you choose Jung, then you compromise instinct, Freud, and psychosocial adaptation, Adler. All three scenarios are a trap. We have to find a way to give the apple to all three, so that Freud, Adler, and Jung are all content. Paris, of course, chose to give the apple to Aphrodite, goddess of love. That is, Freud. This is directly analogous to the adaptive issues today. By choosing Freud, the young man comes to possess what he thinks is beauty, but in doing so, he makes a de facto enemy of Adler. He falls straight into the trap of an overcompensated power drive. With all of this said, I'll hand over to the seminar clip we'd like to share with you today. We really hope that you find it useful and enjoyable. There seems to be a pattern, really common, of young guys projecting inappropriately onto what we could broadly call narcissistic women. Something I've seen a lot, time and time again. I've also seen it the other way around, women projecting onto narcissistic men, but the men were coming up this past week. To me, looking at sort of like an objective third party to what these guys were telling me, it's fairly obvious that these women are inappropriate for them, not good potential love quality or long-term partnership whatsoever, and there's very sort of like light, covert narcissistic abuse going on. My main question around that would be, presumably a young guy is not, most of the time, is not drawn to a woman because of her narcissism. It's the fact, I would imagine, that it's the projection that's blinding them to that narcissism and getting them into all kinds of traps alongside that. So the way that they relate to that woman and are blind to that woman reflects the way they sort of relate to themselves on the inside, sort of at one level. And I was wondering what the general solution to that might be for young guys. Would it simply be a case of, if we can state it simply, those young guys connecting properly to their instincts so that they build up a greater sense of self-respect in themselves, so they're not likely to be abused? So in other words, the projection in the first place doesn't land on an inappropriate hook. Because I've seen this happen time and time again, and always just leads to misery, to be honest.
Yeah, thanks, James. Likewise, we've seen a few people this week with the same kind of problem. There's two elements, obviously, to this. There's the instinctive element, which moves from within, and then there's the cultural element that moves from without. And if we can take it in the running order from inside to out, it's the lack of consciousness, and it's perfectly understandable, of instinct and just how powerful that is. That's the problem, because it is a Paleolithic drive that's pushing these young men, despite how adapted they may feel they are to the time of life that they've reached and to the culture that they're in. Nevertheless, this impulse from within is so ancient and so Darwinian at a competitive level that it's almost as if mating and relating with anyone is better than no one. And if there isn't a conscious position taken towards that, then the instincts will simply align with mate with anyone. And that's where the unconsciousness and the blindness that you refer to comes from. It's a lack of association to instinct. And it can come about where people feel they are well adapted to their environment and to their peer group, and they understand it, and they understand its dynamics, but nevertheless, they feel the impulse. And it is at an affect level of consciousness, which of course goes back to what we've said in recent seminars about the Paleolithic mind, and what happens when a modern human consciousness suddenly intrudes into that Paleolithic affect-based Panksepian consciousness of the past. Well, obviously, for a lot of young men, and not just in this generation, it was the case in mine, and I've no doubt in my parents and grandparents and so on generation, that there is very often no conscious relationship to the affect-based drive and instinct to mate and relate. There's an urgency that's felt in both biological sexes, which is obviously programmed into our evolution. And then secondarily, the rationalizations you get at an ego level, and that can lead people into attempting to bond and to relate and even to mate with the most unsuitable people, it turns out, downstream. And there seems to be a window for this, which kicks off in the late teens and runs to the late 20s, where this is particularly active. After the 20s, it's more a case of being in a cognitive relationship to have not done those things in the teens and the 20s that are most upper conscious, should we say, in again, both biological sexes. But during the late teens and early 20s, the pressure is so imminent and so preoccupying that that's the main thing. I need to do this now. Whereas later, I haven't done it, and I'm suffering from that now. So the problems of adaptation in 30s and later are different from those in the teens and the 20s. But what you can see is a clear biological drive. And there are a number of tripwire ages. I would say for men, it's 20 to 21. And women really start to feel the need to reproduce as an instinct without being conscious of it around the age of 28, 27, 28, that kicks in. And then we see all sorts of issues with respect to how that syncretizes with their lived experience.
Thank you. That does make sense, a lot of sense. It's a slight reframe, therefore, from what I initially would have thought, because what it sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this is likely to be an inevitable thing that will arise for most people anyway, rather than necessarily they're unconscious of their full potential per se. So it's less neurotic in that strict sense, and more a case of the drive for mating spikes up really, really, really high at a certain age.
Yeah.
And you just got to be conscious of where it's going to go on its own, or else it's going to lead more than likely to someone who's not appropriate for a life partner.
Yeah, again, if we apply the Freud-Jung Adler equation, then it is Freud which is pushing, it is instinct that's pushing. And from a Freudian perspective, it's the misalignment between instinct and the environment that generates neurosis. So it's a fundamentally Freudian level of adaptation, and then it moves into an Adlerian one as soon as relating becomes key. But the primary drive is Darwinian and Freudian and has to do with mating. The whole organization of human culture has been predicated upon that. And that's unfortunate, because it means that our consciousness of the implications of that is secondary to the drive. And of course, this is for most people. There are people who don't have those kinds of drive in that way, who have alternative lifestyles, alternative stages and pressures, and that's all fine. There are so many ways of living an authentic life. But for most people, that biological imperative is almost irresistible without generating some kind of neurosis. And so people then find themselves propelled to act. And if they feel they're not acting, or here's an opportunity, and I'll do it with anybody or somebody, because this drive is so overwhelming, and then they suddenly realize they're with the wrong person, or it was under the wrong conditions now. But it wouldn't have been in the Paleolithic period, where the selective pressures were so high and so competitive within a group and from the environment that survival literally depended upon it, not just of the species, but of an individual. If an individual in a Paleolithic environment is not serving a useful purpose for the maintenance of the genome at the group level, then they may well be excluded from social care, from hierarchies, that kind of thing, and would have to find another kind of adaptation. That may have been in the form of being a shaman or a hunter or a warrior, but they would be excluded directly from being involved in reproduction. And the value that a group holds then with a male or a female biologically who can reproduce and who can demonstrate that they can reproduce. So we still have the echoes of that now, and we're unconscious of it. Largely, even when we're told when we're young this is the case, because the switch hasn't thrown, the imperatives are not pressing upon us from within. It's only held as an abstraction or an idea. And then when we start to behave as if that's true, the biological drives and instincts, we're not being cognitive about it sometimes, and that can lead to disasters, or it can lead to a great deal of success, where people don't rush into something, they don't make the wrong choice, they're more careful, they don't allow themselves to be driven by the most fundamental of biological drives, but by some of the more developed ones, so they're closer to meta-instincts.
Okay, and would it be a meta-instinct that runs counter to, say, a Freudian instinct, to say, because presumably a just pure, undistilled Freudian instinct would say any woman would do?
Yeah,
roughly. They'd probably be different for women to some degree, but roughly anyone would do. Would it be a meta instinct that says, but not them? Because with most of those young guys, they will fall into, I've seen them loads of times. There's a narcissistic woman who appears to be somewhat alluring in how they relate to the guy. But then there are also some women who are very, say, sexually open, who the young guys instinctively are repulsed by. Mm-hmm. Would that be more of a meta instinct looking ahead for a life partner, and then a kind of an algorithm is run and there's like a clash between them, or something along those lines?
Yeah, if we take an evolutionary perspective, then what's considered by, say, ethologists to be strategies of adaptation, reproduction, and so forth, those strategies form narratives. And there's a superpositioning between the most basic, almost virtual level of a meta-instinct and then its representation in culture. Once culture starts to transmit these meta-instinctive narratives through myth, value systems, and so forth, in a general sense, then that resonance allows instincts to coalesce around them and produce something which is generally supportive. if we didn't have the meta instincts in culture and also latent within us, we'd be purely Panksepian in our drives. And the resulting adaptive behavior then would be very narrow, highly competitive and highly selective, and much closer to some of our primate relatives than it is to being human. So yes, the meta instincts then are superpositioned. They are in culture and they are in individuals with respect to their learning. And this is where we get the deep structure complexes, of course. And then there's the representation of it within, we'll call it loosely the genome, in other words, the biological representation of that information. And then the field effects, which is Sheldrakean and Penrose. All of that taken together produces a field effect within which we participate as individuals and adapt to the well or to the less well with respect to those pressures.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. So I guess the solution for a lot of these young guys is just try and be as conscious as possible to around what you're doing, around where the fact that it's Freudian and not anything else, like a Jungian mystical romance, for example, to recognize it for what it is, I imagine would probably help.
Yeah, thanks for that, because we started with Freud and that basic Freudian drive is behind all of it. But the Adlerian comes in from the feedback from the culture. When a young man, if we just take that as an example, compares his own success socially and or reproductively with his peers and the potential for him to acquire status, we're in Adler immediately. And that then will begin to conceal, as the formula runs, the Freudian drive beneath it. It modifies it basically, but Freud is still there. There is no Adler without Freud. Then there's a tendency, which is adaptive to some extent, to elevate the idea of a relationship into a so-called Jungian or transcendent, transpersonal level. And that's very powerful for bonding. And it's great if you've got the right person, but if you've got the wrong person, and that you then project in a Jungian way onto an inappropriate partner, male or female, however that works out, then you necessarily fall victim to Adler and Freud behind that. You make an enemy of both. As I said in an earlier seminar, it's like the Judgement of Paris from the Trojan War, from Homer, the Iliad, where he offers an apple to 3 goddesses. He can only choose one, and then he makes an enemy of the other 2. It's a little bit like that with Freud, Adler, and Jung. If we settle on one, we are maladapted to the other 2 by necessity. So if we give Jung the apple, then our social adaptation is compromised, and so is our biology. If we give it to Adler, then our biology is compromised, and so is our potential for a spiritual or transcendent relationship. If we give it to Freud, then we compromise social adaptation and spirituality. We have to find the way of dividing the apple into 3 and satisfying all 3. And of course, initially, that is to say, as a ground state, the drive is to give that to Freud. And then there's a dim awareness of some kind of Adlerian reference. But for some people, there will be a perception of a Jungian level of relationship that's possible. And then some young men and young women will move immediately into that, and they will lose all contact with Freud and Adler. And a significant amount of those young people will then fall victim in a compensatory way to the Adlerian power drive of internet gurus, and also to their suggestions about how they should live their life biologically. And then they fail to adapt. It may not be complete, it may not be forever, but definitely that will happen. Paul, she's hovering. I know she wants to speak.
Well, for me, and for a lot of these young men, I think we're looking in the wrong place, in so much as what you've just said there, Steve, about the Jungian inflation, I think is in part key to understanding why they fall into the trap that they do. Because what happens essentially is they do James has suggested with respect to the narcissism. And because they inflate on the inside with respect to idealized versions of women, and they expect them to be out there in the outside world, they then tend to project that. So immediately they fall victim to Jung.
Yeah.
And because they fall victim to Jung, and they haven't given sufficient attention to the way that women are and the way that women operate and women's strategies for getting men, if I can put it that crudely, they don't see the trap they're making and creating for themselves. And because a lot of those women that I'm describing in terms of relationships are very often very savvy, and they've actually worked out a strategy or a plan, or they believe they have, for bringing the men that they want to bring into their lives and deciding on how those men should be. The young men that are looking for relationships are ripe for falling into that very trap of Adler, which is waiting for them down the road, because that's what these women by and large want. They want to draw men in to their lives over whom they can have complete and utter control. And if these young men are still caught up with Jungian ideas and to some extent their own narcissistic relationship towards themselves, they'll deliver that into the world. They project it onto these young women who don't match up, don't square up to that projection, and immediately Adler steps in. And the thing about Adler, whichever side of the equation it's on, whether it's coming from the young woman or the young man, is the very thing that will destroy relationships further down the road. Because anything to do with power in a relationship is just undesirable, really. It's the antithesis of a loving, healthy, vibrant, passionate relationship with a kind of live and let live philosophy to it, where there's an equal partnership within that relationship, and that couple, whoever they are essentially developing themselves and understand their own boundaries and limitations and are accepting of the other. So Adler is death to relationships, really, once he steps in. And I do think that this is really where the young men out there need to sort of focus their attention. They need to get to grips with women and to realize that a lot of them have already worked out in a very calculated way how they're going to make their move. And sadly, a lot of them just aren't ready for that, because they've been so tied up with fantasy and their own fantasy relating towards themselves and therefore to the women that they meet. So I would suggest that that's the place to look. And I think we've done this before, because you've said it so often, Steve, that if you want to understand women, you really do need to understand the animus and get to grips with that. Then you know what you're up against.
And not the anima.
And not the anima.
Yeah.
No.
Thank you for the detail on that, Paul. That was very helpful. So in effect then, the young men who move towards Jung will fall victim to Adler.
They will.
And by falling victim to Adler, they're falling victim to the latent presence of Freud with respect to gratification.
That's right.
Yeah.
And of course the culture supports that, because it's I think we've said before, there is such a tremendous portion, to some extent it's an artifact of nearly 300 years of feminism, that women should be out there in an aggressive way, seeking power for themselves in relationships. It's actively encouraged that women do that. And then, these young men who, with the best of intentions, wanting a loving and fulfilling relationship, with not just a physical relationship, but with good relating that will persist over time, don't realize that that's not what they're getting. And it's a very sad indictment, really, isn't it, of the times we live in. But we can't ignore cultural pressure and forces, because they are real. And where there's unconsciousness, and generally there is in young people, because they haven't had the life experience to know otherwise, and their tendency is they'll fall victim to cultural ideas and start to express them.
Thanks for that again, Paul. So with respect to instinct then, it's in the absence of experience, which is more cognitive and associated to your developing personality, that in the absence of that, the instinct then fills the gap.
It does.
And it'll do so for evolutionary reasons, because in the past there may not have been time to acquire experience, because experience may delete us from the gene pool. And that may include things like disease, war, not just competition as such. So it's understandable that the biological imperative is there, but the Adlerian element has to be there too, in order to keep a social bond and a group together, which supports the genome. But as you say, the movement into an idealized state of projection of what Jungians call the anima for a young man has a moral quality to it, which is lovely.
It is lovely,
but it's also potentially fatal.
Oh God,
and in that sense, then the so-called Jungian negative anima can be concealed by the persona of the positive anima that is projected from within to without. So there's a lack of reality orientation then by these young men because of instinctive pressure. And by the time their psyche hits the Jungian projection, it's already behind the curve of adaptation. And the positive anima goes out in order perhaps to conceal the true state of some of these women and their power drives and their Freudian elements. So that will, if you like, compel the man then to mate and relate with his projection rather than the reality, or to attempt to. So you can see even behind that there is Freud. Even behind Jung there is Freud.
There is. They're just all, they're all strategies, aren't they, of one form or another. And I think the point you made about how things are now as opposed to how things were in the Paleolithic. Well, you're right to say that times were hard back then and life was short, but we, by and large, were living longer and longer and longer. So the opportunity for relationships to persist over time is far greater as well. And it's how we adapt to that. You know, how do you keep a relationship going over decades as opposed to just months or, you know, years? It's a real challenge. And I think it can only come through good relating and a respect for the other person, proper boundaries. And again, that can only be achieved really where there's a full conscious awareness of power play, really. And where Adler is present, it's the kiss of death. I mean, we all know, we're all familiar with the expression, you know, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts. Absolutely, it does. It does. And really, it's the last thing that you want in an intimate relationship.
And the one thing that would serve irreducibly is Freud. At Freud's worst, because we're talking about pathology, not about the better side. So when we use the Freud-Adler-Jung equation, we're talking about the pathology that arises from that. So that's what we will see always behind Adler. Where Adler is, in a pathological sense, is going wrong, then we know for sure Freud is also going wrong. Where Jung has gone wrong, we know the other two have definitely gone wrong. But the flow of energy, if you like, is downwards once this corruption sets in. So when Adler goes wrong, then we know really behind that, very thinly concealed, is a very high quanta of energy, which is instinctive and Freudian in a pathological gratification sense.
And that's very infantile. Of course, isn't it, as well? And once people relate to one another in an infantile way, inevitably parental complexes come into play. And then we're back to power again.
And we're back to power. But, and also with respect to the parental complexes, we've got socialization, early socialization, because we learn how to relate through our parents, principally parents or caregivers. That has obviously an evolutionary adaptive purpose to it, modified by our present times and everything that's led up to that. But that will include things like character, which is obviously genetic to a great extent, or it's inherited biologically. It's not completely so, but where it is. And then experience, so early sexualization, and then the value that's put on that seems to be key. That's something that comes through with paedophilia a lot, doesn't it?
It does.
And where people have been sexualized as a child, they're more likely to be paedophiles themselves, because the switching on of something which should have been delayed, it's become part of the developing ego, the self-concept of the victim of paedophilia. As they then develop and mature, then the internalized images, we could say in a Jungian sense, the anima and the animus, coalesce around a young person. So the age at which somebody's sexualized can be involved in, you know, downstream effects with respect to relating. And another thing can be that if a person's early experience is only sexual without any kind of emotional social bonding, then that can become an issue as well, because relating thereafter through a relationship bond which is supposed at a biological level to bring about the creation of a family and a new generation, the sexual element is not connected to that in a way that we could elevate that into a Jungian level of relationship. It's far more biological. And so then the social relationship within the marriage or wherever that kind of relationship is being directed by that early sexual experience. So the value of sex then is reduced, therefore the value of the bond is reduced, therefore the boundaries in the relationship are porous, and we can see marriages and relationships starting to fail. But I was reminded of that when you said about long-term relationships, how they should be maintained. And a lot of that will have to do with how people have come to terms with their own early sexual experience. And if they haven't come to terms with it, insofar as they haven't developed it through a healthy adaptation to Freud, Adler and Jung, you are necessarily going to see, as a result, a more reductive engagement with those processes and with those instincts. And therefore then, this is after the Freudian level, therefore then at the psychosocial level, which is Adler, and then some people will never reach a Jungian level at all, not even in fantasy, because the gratification element has been so strong, and then the power element to achieve gratification is so strong, they will find it very, very difficult to relate in a long-term way, if that's their goal. I mean, obviously under certain conditions, it's the right thing. You know, and there are many ways to live an authentic life, but it is a way of understanding how these things unfold.
It is, and obviously something like paedophilia is an extreme example, but as we often say, the extreme examples often illustrate things very clearly.
They do.
And with paedophiles, that's one thing that you do see, is that a tremendous amount of libido goes into that and only that. That, you know, their life is literally taken up by it, and you know, the seeds of that, I should say, maybe in something like precocious sexuality, you know, exposure to sexual behavior at a very young age inappropriately. Although I have to say there are some people who do go through that and nonetheless correct for it later on.
Absolutely.
And they don't actually continue that on in their own lives when they come to have relationships and families themselves. But where there's probably a strong genetic component to paedophilia, I think almost certainly that's what you see. And you could say really that Freud is elevated there to such an extent that, you know, Adler and Jung almost don't get a look in. And
where they exist, they actually both conceal Freud at that point.
Yes, they do. Absolutely. But, you know, sort of moving away from paedophilia, sort of back along the continuum to more of a sort of a golden mean position. I think for people who have, through no fault of their own, been sexualized early on, then the chances are when they come to form relationships, then that those they're more likely to tend towards promiscuity as well, because they'd be more open sexually to having those kinds of
the boundaries are broken.
The boundaries are broken. They're more porous, and so they're vulnerable in that way then. And if that person has, you know, further down the line formed a relationship, married, whatever, then that relationship longer term is still vulnerable to those same challenges that were operating at the beginning. And I mean, they can be corrected for, as can all things.
But you're right.
But
it's
you know,
what you see.
it is what you see. And in a long-term relationship, they're the challenges, aren't they? Because as we've said before, there's often somebody else waiting in the wings,
always,
to step in.
Because that's Darwin again, isn't it? You know, Darwin and Freud, they're holding hands. so to speak, as they creep up behind Adler.
Yeah. So consciousness is key to all of this, isn't it?
Yeah,
and unfortunately, very often we fall victim to these things before we can become conscious of them and do something about them.
Yeah,
we tend to be in the mess first.
That's the Paleolithic imperative of do something before you delete it. You know, which under Paleolithic pressure, you can see that would have to be the case. But we're stuck with it to some extent.
We have to run with it, don't we?
We do. Yeah, we have got an evolved frontal lobe now, and we can work things through. But that doesn't come online fully sometimes until the mid-20s. Until
the mistakes are made.
Yeah, the mid-20s.
Yes.
You know, it's
very, very common.
Catch-22, isn't it?
Yeah.
Thanks, James. I hope that was something of an answer.
It was. There's so much in there. Thank you so much. Thank you. Just a quick one, because this was something you were talking about towards the end there about being sexualized at a young age. Because I remember reading in Freud, it looks to me like he went way OTT with what that might potentially look like, especially with suggesting things to people as something that happened in the past that clearly didn't. And even if it did, it appeared to be very, very, very not, it was a bit blurry on the details to me. So if the boundaries around that could be sort of fleshed out, I think that'd be really useful for therapeutic practice. So basically, is being sexualized early mean your personal boundaries to do with you as a person, your body, were physically crossed by someone else long before your biology was ready for that kind of thing? Or could it be as simple as hearing about something or seeing something? Because we do live in quite a sexualized society and culture today.
Yeah, they're both possible, obviously, and it all depends on if we take that to be the figure, the ground of the complete context of a person. In the Paleolithic environment, there would have been sexual abuse, there would have been, and for obvious reasons, the same reason that it exists now. And some of that will be pure Freudian. You know, I've in both of my main careers, I've experienced paedophilias in the sense of having met them and heard what they have to say. And some of the ones I'm thinking of, particularly from my police work, and I know that's a collapsed context, but within that would say things like, well, if they're big enough, they're old enough. And in that sense, that's the kind of mindset that they had, that if a young girl was big enough, literally big enough, without recourse to their age or development, then they are old enough. And that's a hugely challenging thing to try to think about, because there's an immediate, there was for me anyway, instinctive revulsion for that, which just the shutter comes down and the judgment is that is bad, which it is. But that can stop us to try to make an attempt to understand under what conditions, evolutionary conditions, would that have emerged. That kind of exaggerated selective pressure probably for some people had an adaptive value a long time ago when populations were small and competition for available breeding resources were very, very tight, and in that sense the competition was extremely high, and some people would have moved that way in order to secure a breeding partner for later, for downstream. And then, of course, to counter that, the resistances to that, which is the common, almost instinctive, it probably is an instinctive revulsion in most people, would have emerged to stop that happening and to driving the population down. And there are all sorts of reasons why that would happen, including inbreeding and so forth. So we've got that left as a hangover within us. And some people along the distribution curve exhibit paedophilia as a genetic imprint of character, and others acquire it through a distortion of their own boundaries by others who should be caregivers. And children are very capable of making very strong emotional bonds to other children. And if that becomes sexualized by a third party or by an older child, that can predispose someone to becoming vulnerable in a number of ways. But again, you can see where that would come in a Paleolithic sense, because the extreme selective pressure of the environment would generate all of these as kinds of adaptive strategies that would persist sufficiently long for it to become ingrained within the genome of some people as being a potential strategy for life. But what you say, though, being exposed to pornography when you're young can have an effect, there's no doubt. But again, we need to know the context of the individual. And being sexualized by a third party, as Pauline very rightly pointed out, does not mean you will become, in other words, if you're a victim, that you will become a paedophile yourself. There are some people who have had no experience directly, but it's in their character, insofar as it's in their genome, that they will go that way and they will do that thing. But you will find that later on, when you do relationship work, I know you've done some, James, but as you build on your experience, that is often a factor that will select for whether a relationship is stable or not, is simply how young and under what conditions was an individual person sexualized relative to their partner. Because one of the things about a stable relationship is that there has to be agreement between the parties involved about what the relationship is, and that includes boundaries for things like that. And if people are operating by different value systems and through different experiences, then conflict can emerge on that basis. There are people who've been promiscuous when they were younger and then settled down and are completely happy, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with being promiscuous or not making a value judgment. I'm just saying that when things go wrong, that can be an issue. But there are people then who've been sexualized when they're young, and they go into a relationship, and then the idea of being unfaithful, it's just a number. It's like, well, I've had so many partners, what does one more matter? If I feel like it, I will, but I'm still committed to the relationship, psychosocially. And the other party might say, I don't like that, that is threatening, and that will be instinctive, because any children, you don't know who the father or is, for example. So again, the Paleolithic mind steps in, Freud steps in, and Freud is regulated within the relationship by Adlerian power dynamics that Pauline mentioned. And that then compromises any projection at a Jungian level that went into the formation of that relationship initially. Obviously, the easiest and most clearest example would be an idealized young man that's got into a relationship with a very experienced and promiscuously minded woman who just doesn't care, but may not think that's going to compromise the relationship, because she has the power and control over the man who has collapsed around an idealized image of relating, and therefore she can control him on that basis while she goes out and samples whoever she wants to, when she wants to, because the value of sex for her is not as elevated as it would be for the other party, for the man, for the inexperienced young man who comes into that relationship and has Jungian ideals. And there are all sorts of stories and myths about how this can be handled. There are Arthurian ones too, which deal with that. There's one in particular, I won't go into the details, but it involves a particular knight, and it's not Lancelot or Galahad even, it's another one of them, who was very, very moral and ethic, and who met the wrong girl. And she, in modern terms, shit tests him to the nth degree and humiliates him right, left and center, including siding with the opposition. Where he tries to protect her, she supports the assailant against him, and he puts up with it and puts up with it. And then, just as she realizes the true value in him, he decides to leave her and goes off with her sister instead. And her sister is closer to him in attitude and in value. And you can see the Jungian element in that immediately. The divided feminine into the siblings, the sisters, one of whom is very Freudian and Adlerian, and then the other one who is closer to the young man, the young knight, who is trying to live what he regards as being a virtuous life. And then just as that woman who has pushed the Freudian and Adlerian boundaries to establish her power and dominance, and there is a correlation with today. This is going on a lot now. It's a theme.
It is
not just a meme. It's an actual theme. It's a trope of adaptation.
Yeah.
He decides to leave her and punish her that way.
Yeah.
She ends up then presumably childless and without a relationship, and without the elevation that comes from withholding behaving in an unrestricted Freudian way and Adlerian way. And then there are other examples. Even in religion, you get the elevation of prostitutes sometimes. They get elevated into a Jungian level. Mary Magdalene, for example, is the clearest version of that we're going to be familiar with in the West. But that idea is all over the place. So these dynamics are unknown. They've been acted out through history continuously, and they are lessons of adaptation collectively. And the culture seems to want, through cultural inheritance, to help young men, to prepare them before they get the experience, which could be very bad for them, by providing these narratives, which will link, hopefully, in with their meta instincts, which would accept a certain narrative as being the one that they would want and would choose under ideal conditions. But if that then is released inappropriately because of instinctive pressure from Panksepp, then there's a mismatch between Panksepp and the meta instinct, and then you get neurosis.
Thank you. You've gone back around and answered some of the other things I wanted to ask you too about on the projection thing, because it seems to be coming down a lot to guys need to understand the animus, sort of end of ground state. And it sounds to me like if they, I have seen this to some degree, not massively, but when I've seen a young guy get sort of to grips with the animus, or in other words, what's really sort of going on underneath the projection, it's as if there's an instinctual wall that comes up or a revulsion that goes on to be like, stop manipulating me.
Yeah.
Which presumably is instinctive on that front, even if there's a competing drive under frustrated instincts to say the culture's kind of screwed, maybe I should just breed with anyone, like you were saying at the start. I guess that comes down to character at the end of the day, as to sort of which one of those wins out in someone.
It does, character and experience, which then obviously modulates character, and that's another source of neurosis. As Pauline said in the past about this on other seminars and in videos, that it's character versus instinct as well sometimes, because Pankseppian instincts in their raw elemental form are independent of character, which is a peculiar thing to consider. But character gets pushed by Panksepp and forced into grooves that express it, unless that character distills out through the development of an ego, a modern ego, and says, this is not right. And oddly enough, the system as a whole will agree with that. And this is Freud's pleasure principle, as he understood it, versus the reality principle. The ego's role is to exercise the reality principle by checking instinct, Pankseppian ones in effect, against the world. But Freud missed out largely the meta-instinctive context, and Jung picked up on that. And then he developed his idea about archetypes and so forth to put that missing piece into the jigsaw. Oh, yeah. Oh, and by the way, Pauline's actually in the book that she's writing up. I haven't left the cat out the bag, but when I mentioned that Arthurian myth without naming it, Pauline's actually discussing that, but in a modern context, and developing that out as part of a book, which I must say, I think it's just fantastic. There's going to be nothing like it out there covering this topic. It's educated me for sure. It'll be very interesting.
Well, you're very kind to say that, Steve. I think what I'd like to do, as probably just as a chapter in it, is to write what is basically a modern fairy tale about the way that things are, but obviously learning from the past, and as you say, all these lessons of adaptation, but bringing them up to date to the 21st century, and hopefully that will be a way of getting it across, but in a modern context. And just coming back to what you were saying before that, Steve, about relationships, and also James asking about, to some extent, how men can deal with some of these things practically. I would simply say to that it's probably important not to play the game, because it is about game playing. And obviously, certainly at the beginning of relationships for men and women, play is as an instinct is an important part of getting to know one another, because the novelty of being with somebody who's new and working out where, you know, you fit in it with respect to one another in terms of status and so on. All those sort of games are going on. But when play becomes corrupted, as it inevitably does, as people enter into relationships in an unconscious state, then I think the thing to distill out with respect for men, with respect to the animus, is not to play the game, because that's a masculine thing to do, to take a stand or a position against it, so you don't allow yourself to be manipulated into a situation that weakens you, I think is really important. And that could be anything. It could just be that the tension is so unbearable that you capitulate and you give in to something, which you know to be bullying. But for the sake of, you know, just getting on and getting through the day, you decide it's better to go with it than take a stand against it. And, you know, men typically do this, for example, and we've seen it with our some of our close friends. I'm thinking of one in particular that it's an example that you often cite, Steve, to do with a mother and a son relationship, actually. When there was conflict between them, cutting a long story short, and the resolution of that conflict was for the son to buy the mother flowers.
Oh yeah,
and
yeah.
You actually watched him chase her down the street with him, didn't you?
I did.
And despite all of that, she was still disapproving of him. The detail doesn't really matter. The point is, you know, that young man collapsed under the pressure of his mother's disapproval and gave in to her animus in that way. And there are so many ways that you can give in. That's just one that comes to mind. And I really do think that's important for men. And I think where they have their own core set of values, that's what they have to refer to in order to make the stand. And it's a very masculine thing to do. It's a very strong thing to do, and it doesn't do women any favors to give in that way, because they don't develop either. They'll just continue to bully. We see it all the time. And she does. And in this particular case, this woman does do that.
I could give a little bit of detail. That this lady was a kept woman materially, wasn't she?
Yeah.
And her own capacity could not have matched what her husband provided.
No.
But she drove him into alcoholism and eventual early death.
She did.
And her two sons, one of them at least, and it's the one we ran after with the flowers, replaced his father and has become an alcoholic.
He has,
and she's still a bully.
Yes.
So her animus has never been reined in, even when it was satiated with her every desire for status and for materialism. It was not enough. It could not be satiated. And she was abused as a child.
She was,
And there's no suggestion she abused him in a sexual way, her children, but she did through Adler. And Adler conceals Freud. So we know that and the gratification was unsatiable or insatiable. And in that sense, that carried on. And then he idealized his mother, probably. In fact, I'm pretty sure he did.
Well, you knew him well.
I did. And he would have seen her as having this palace-like home and all the material possessions, and she looked down on everybody.
Yes, she did.
And so the formation of his anima was women were like that. This is the son. So he then ran round after her, trying to elevate her in that way. And then no woman he could meet would ever match that woman who was controlling him and being elevated at the same time. So he tried the flowers thing, and it was in public, and they didn't know I could see this. I was on the other side of the road, but it was shocking because it was naked in the sense that it was open.
Well, it was literally in public.
It was literally in public, and it was the utter disdain. But that kept him trapped. So his animal would be in a terrible state, because as we know, the mother for a boy is the port reeve of the unconscious, basically. She shapes his relationship to himself on the inside, which is then projected out and acts out in the world. And that's what we saw. And now he's replaced his father, not only because his father's died, but because he's become the alcoholic that his father was, which in part is probably an attempt for him to assert his masculinity by being like his father, to contradict the power of his mother, but it's not worked.
Yeah, it hasn't worked. And neither of the sons are in relationships.
No, they're not.
No.
Only to the mother.
Only to the mother,
Yeah. Just a bit of background for that.
Yes, sure.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
It's amazingly useful. I love case studies like that. It puts things into perspective. When you say, or you mentioned the part about the young guy running after his mother with the flowers, and then Pauline, you said that men need to sort of like stand up for themselves, really, and not sort of like give into this kind of thing. Again, must have been over the last 6, 7, 8 years maybe, when I've spoken to guys around my age, a little bit younger, and I've kind of encouraged them to stand up for themselves, really. The immediate thing is, but she might leave me, in one word or another. I see in there a if not, therefore she's manipulating you at the level of Freud, as well as, say, just psychosocially with Adler. And then Freud is the first thing that you hear actually being spoken about. So it's access to a reproductive partner, essentially. And so having frustrated Freud allows one to be manipulated easier by somebody else, hence perhaps the attraction or the sustained pseudo relationship with a narcissistic woman in the first place. They're more desperate, and they're okay to sort of settle in that regard, even if it means lowering their self-respect. I don't know if that makes sense, but what you said there made loads of things click for me there, like all at once.
It does make perfect sense when you think narcissism as a strategy in a woman in a Paleolithic environment. It makes sense, because if she can raise her apparent status and at the same time be controlling and bullying, that will be intriguing to a man who, through his Jungian style projection, will try and make sense of what he's meeting. And then he'll become, even in a Paleolithic environment, a prodromal version of the medieval knight, and want to go and rescue the woman, and then walk into the trap. Next thing you know, the woman's pregnant, and he's trapped by that. And then the social bond, the social group, which would try to optimize for reproductivity of the group, because it's being driven by biology. The whole group has been, in that period of time, would have been driven that way. Even the social group organizations would be emphasizing that. He's completely trapped. He's been pulled in. The woman says, I am high value. And you get this now. This is a trope now. So women of low value project being of high value. And they exhibit a kind of narcissism to say, I can do this because I am powerful. Therefore, I am worth having. So it's a Paleolithic adaptation. It's as if civilization's never happened. And what do we see? We see that civilization is unwinding itself. It's breaking down. And it's showing up in that form in the women. And men don't know what to do about it, a lot of them.
I think if men can get over the threat that if they stand up to the woman, that they're going to lose them. And rather than being pulled into a kind of an irrational state over that they make a stand, and they may be the first person who has actually done that in that woman's life. It might be the first time she's been told this far and no further. And sometimes the shock of that man isn't going to be pushed around, that person can, or that woman can have, the biggest tantrum on the planet, and it doesn't matter, because they are so self-assured, or so self-accepting and accepting of their own nature and their own core values, that it doesn't actually matter either way. That can have a huge impact on women who try that kind of thing out. And if you think about it rationally, often when women do this kind of thing, I mean, it's so silly, really. It's so regressive and infantile. If they storm out, or they threaten to take the children with them, or whatever, and yet they've actually got no means of supporting themselves independently, it's never going to happen anyway. So I think it's useful to not allow yourself to be overwhelmed by the irrational when something like that happens, but to take a step back and to say, well, okay, you know, you go over there somewhere and have your tantrum. I'll be here when you get back, and things will be pretty much the same as they were before you went. But I'm not going to give in to that kind of manipulation. And that's very masculine. It's a very strong stance to take, and ultimately it will help the woman develop herself.
Yeah, it's masculine, isn't it, in a specific form, which links with the so-called animus in a woman. And I think this is behind why Jungians think that women have an animus, they have a masculine side. And it's actually just the exchange of power, isn't it? And control.
It is.
But when it's rooted inside a woman, it gets called the animus.
It does, yeah.
But the thing that really distills out, or the things that distill out the anima functionally in a man that you can observe in any man, boils down to what the Jungians call the negative anima, usually, because that's the disturbance in the behavior that you see. So you see the moodiness and that kind of behavior that comes out of a man that can lead him to control women through his moods.
Yes.
But also you see the anima in the way that the Jungians talk about it being a death demon, which can lead a man into depression and suicide. Yeah. We can think about that in a Jungian way, but we can look at it from a Darwinian way as well. That's the shit test for sure, but it's coming from within. And it's like, if you will not assert yourself, you may as well not be here. Yes. And when men who are on the verge of contemplating suicide hear that voice, or they create that voice with an inner dialogue, yes, that is the negative anima, but it's also the genome. It's saying you're expensive for resources for the group in a Paleolithic environment. You're taking resources. There are other people in this group who share your genes. They're spread out a bit. You know, it's not your specific genome, but they share it. So therefore, in a Paleolithic environment, depression and suicide would have some adaptive value if someone was not functioning optimally in a competitive sense. But that's carried over as well. And we see that, and it takes on that form. So you can see why the Jungians have come up with this idea that a woman has a masculine side, because when a man is in relationship to his positive anima, that's completely different. That's Jungian, literally, in that elevated sense of the way that he will approach not only women, but anything, how he will relate to causes, ideologies, religion, that kind of thing. It's that elevated, inflated element. So that must have an adaptive value too. And women should have the capacity to recognize that that's useful. Otherwise, they wouldn't want to go near a man who's like that. And this is the problem, because if a man has those values but has nothing else, it's of no interest at all. If a man has those values and has some capacity, you know, to earn money and resources, protect the woman, and is masculine in other ways, that is the elevated icing on the cake, because it elevates him beyond his compatriots. He's more likely to be loyal, supportive and protective of the woman. So it's a downstream value. So oddly enough, to understand a woman, a man needs to understand the animus and then see a reflection of an aspect of his masculinity that he needs to kindle in order to control the woman's Adlerian drive. And behind that is the Darwinian competition, which says that a woman should exhibit shit testing in order to see if the man is of value or not. And all of that was good back then, and it's unfortunate now. But civilization is collapsing, and control over reproduction for women has allowed the Adlerian element to come forward, and they're fully indulging it.
Oh yes, they are.
And there isn't an organized masculine response to that.
No,
but one of the things in the past that would have been a selective thing would have been that men generally fight the wars. That means that the male population is driving itself down all the time through competition, and that would mean, say, in the First World War, certainly in the countries that were affected, and in the Second World War, there would be more women than men. That means the women have to become competitive amongst themselves for the fewer number of men that are left. And at that point, certain values that will appeal to the men will be selected for, and the women will move in that direction, which is what we saw in the 1950s following the Second World War, and that real establishment of the family and so-called traditional family values. And then, of course, the control over reproduction came in, the population of men rose back up again in the 60s, and we got the beginning of the counterculture and how that's evolved on, and now we've got what we've got now. And civilization is driving itself down, hopefully not towards an extinction event, but no, it's latent. The potential for that is latent.
Yeah. Well, I think men are fighting back. You see more and more of this kind of thing, you know, on platforms like YouTube, and you know, they're kind of restating, and they shouldn't have to do this, but they're almost restating their own value,
yeah,
and their own worth. And we were watching something recently, and it was interesting because the kind of things that were being restated as the kinds of things that we all know, like you say, that it tends to be men who go to war, it tends to be men who create the infrastructure for societies, the guys who, you know, stay up all night to lay motorways or whatever else. And by and large, a lot of what they do tends to be things that women wouldn't want to do. They like to think they could do it or would do it, but they don't. It's an indulgence because they become so comfortably off, a lot of them, that they're in a position to manipulate the narrative. And I think the more that men start to reassert their own value, both in terms of their own relationships, but maybe more broadly through the kind of you know, information that they share through social media, the better. And I think it's starting slowly to happen. Nowhere near like enough of it, but it is starting to happen.
But we've got that polarity, though, haven't we, as well, where you've got the hypertrophied caricature of the masculine, which has been pushed by internet gurus, and therefore providing the women who are pushed towards the woke with every reason, apparently, to reject those features. So the split's widening. It may well take a civilization level collapse for a restoration point to emerge, whereby men are forced to take control of the environment in a Paleolithic way. And then women will need to adjust to that. And I'm not saying that's a good thing, because the whole process is a disaster. It could have been avoided. It's not been avoided. There's a general level of unconsciousness, isn't there, which is contributing to that, plus other things. Oh yeah, there's a lot to it. It's multi-dimensional, isn't it?
It is, but we can, to some extent, make headway in our own relationships by being aware of some of these dynamics. We are at least in the fortunate position of being able to discuss things in the way that we are now, and we have a degree of consciousness that other people don't have, so, you know, available to us, so we can choose to make things different on a purely personal level. And as you often say, that's incremental anyway.
It is.
You know, it's just another grain of sand on the scales in the opposite direction.
We can only live our own life as a figure. We're set against the ground of our times and our culture, but we have to live ourselves as a figure in relationship to others. And then, as you say, gradually the ground will change.
It will,
And as therapists, that's where we work anyway. We work with individuals. Usually, most effectively. If we're regulating a group, a therapy group, the dynamic and the goal is different for that. But the level of the individual is a very deep mine shaft, isn't it?